On the 9th of October 1954, Wendell Tolliver climbed down into the root cellar behind his farmhouse in Bellwood Hollow, Christian County, Missouri, to clear it out for winter, the way he had every autumn since buying the place 8 years before. And what he found behind the canning shelves that afternoon was a second door. He was 48, a dairyman by trade, the kind who kept a ledger of every jar he put up and every jar he pulled, and when he pried the third shelf away from the wall to check for water damage, his lantern found a slab of hewn limestone set into the earth where there should have been nothing but packed dirt and root hair. The door stood about 3 feet high, framed in hand-planed wood, gone soft and grey with age, and it had a latch on the near side. That detail bothered him before he could say why. A latch only goes on the side where someone means to keep a thing out, or keep a thing in, and either way, this one faced him. He called down his son. Garrett came with a second lantern, and the two men stood in a cellar they had walked through 100 times without once suspecting it held a second room, and neither of them touched the latch that evening. Wendell would tell a county surveyor 3 weeks later that he had known right then, standing in that cold with the lamp shaking slightly in his own hand, that whatever they decided about the door was going to outweigh every other decision either of them had made in years. He climbed back up the ladder and slept on it. He said afterward that this was the last full night of sleep he got in that house. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Bellwood Hollow sits in the western folds of Christian County, a country of steep timbered ridges and thin bottomland that the county did not reach with gravel road until 1938, and even then, only as far as the schoolhouse at the mouth of the hollow. Beyond that point, a wagon track climbed another 1.5 miles through hickory and shortleaf pine to reach the Tolliver place, which had been built, according to the county assessor's card, sometime before 1890 by a family named Corliss. The nearest telephone in those years sat at a general store 4 miles down the wagon track, and the nearest doctor practiced in Ozarks, a 2-hour ride by wagon in dry weather and considerably longer after rain, which was the ordinary arithmetic of that entire country and not a mark against it. Men farmed corn and ran a few hogs on mast in the timber, women kept gardens and put up what the season gave them, and a family could go a month without seeing anyone outside its own fence line and think nothing of it. This is the fact that has to sit underneath everything that follows. Isolation that deep was not a sign that something was wrong. It was simply how that ridge worked, for every family in it, in every decade before the road came through. The Corlisses farmed that ground for 4 decades and then, in the spring of 1931, stopped. The tax rolls show the property going to auction for delinquency that same year, 3 payments behind, which was not unusual anywhere in the Ozarks during those seasons, except that neighbors who filed claims on abandoned Corliss livestock told the assessor's clerk that the house had been left mid-chore. A washtub sat full of grey water on the porch. 2 mules were still in harness in the barn, dead of thirst by the time anyone found them, which meant no one had come by in the better part of a week, and a bread pan sat in the oven with the loaf gone to stone inside it. Nobody in the hollow could say when the Corlisses had actually gone, only that at some point they had stopped being there, and that this had seemed, at the time, less like news and more like weather. It took 13 years for the county to resell the land, which itself was unusual. Land in that country, however poor, rarely sat idle that long, and the assessor's card carries a note in a second hand, undated, reading simply held pending inquiry, with no inquiry ever recorded as completed. Wendell Tolliver bought it in 1946 from a bank in Ozarks for $400, site only partly seen, and spent 2 years making the house livable before he moved his wife Opal and their son in. He knew the Corliss name from the deed and nothing else. Nobody offered him more, and for 8 years he had not thought to ask. What Wendell and Garrett found once they finally opened the door, on the 3rd night, is preserved almost word for word, because Wendell wrote it down himself in a farm ledger the same evening, in the plain hand of a man recording weather and feed costs, not a man building a story. The latch gave easily. Beyond it ran a passage cut through native rock rather than dug, walled on both sides with the same hewn limestone as the doorframe, laid without visible mortar, tight enough that Wendell wrote he could not seat a knife blade between two of the courses. The passage ran level for what he paced at 11 feet before opening into a chamber roughly the size of a small room, and the temperature in that chamber, by his account, sat a full 20 degrees below the cellar behind them, cold enough that both men's breath showed in lantern light where it had not a few feet back. The air moving through it, he noted, moved in one direction only, out toward the cellar rather than in, though he could find no opening anywhere in the chamber wide enough to account for a draught of that strength. Along the near wall, someone had built a shelf into the stone itself, and on that shelf sat a single tin box, rusted shut, and a child's shoe, badly rotted, alone, with no match anywhere in the chamber, and no child of an age to wear it recorded in either the Corliss household or the Tolliver one. There was also, cut into the wall opposite the shelf, a row of shallow grooves, evenly spaced, waist height, that Wendell measured at 3/4 of an inch deep, and could not explain by any tool damage he recognized from 40 years of farm work. Garrett, 22 at the time, and not a man given to nerves by his father's later account, put his hand flat against the grooved wall to steady himself and pulled it back within the same second, saying only that the stone there was colder than the stone anywhere else in the chamber, colder by enough that he could feel the difference plainly through a wool glove. Wendell wrote that the grooves ran the width of the chamber, in a straight line, level to the eye, and that he counted 31 of them before he stopped counting, and that he could not afterwards say with any certainty why 31 had been the number where his nerve gave out, rather than any number before it. The county did not send anyone out right away. Wendell reported the find to the sheriff's office in Ozarks on the strength of the tin box alone, expecting at most a records check, and a deputy named Cassius Lloyd drove out 3 days later, more out of routine than urgency, to log the discovery and take a statement for the file. Lloyd's own account, 2 paragraphs long and signed, records that he did not go past the shelf himself, and gives no reason for stopping there beyond noting that he had a bad knee and the passage ceiling ran low. It was only because the State Highway Department had a survey crew already working Christian County that fall, laying preliminary lines for a proposed reservoir project on the Sable Fork, that a geologist happened to be within reach at all. His name was Alton Percy Reeves, 36, employed by the state to assess bedrock stability ahead of dam construction, and he drove out to Bellwood Hollow on the 14th of October at the sheriff's request, expecting an old spring house or a collapsed well. His field notes, filed with the survey office, described the passage in language close to Wendell's own. Coursed limestone, no mortar, a level maintained across 11 feet that Reeves called, in his own words, better than most contractors in that county could manage with instruments. He photographed the grooves in the far wall, but did not photograph the shelf, and his notes offer no explanation for that omission, though the negative for the groove photograph survives in the survey office archive to this day, catalogued and unremarkable, filed between 2 photographs of unrelated bedrock outcrops, as though nothing about it had struck the office as worth setting apart. He did record the tin box as recovered evidence, logged under a case number that no longer corresponds to anything in the county's surviving index, and he noted, in a single clipped line near the bottom of the page, that the passage did not match the construction style of the farmhouse above it by at least a century, possibly more, and that further assessment should wait for someone with training he did not personally have. Nobody with that training was ever sent. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Reeves requested a transfer out of the district 11 days later. His personnel file, which survives only because it was filed separately from his field reports, gives the reason as a family matter and offers nothing further. He left state employment entirely within 2 years and does not appear to have worked in geology again. Bellwood Hollow was not the only place in that country where a second door turned up behind a first one. In 1942, 26 miles east in a settlement called Pruett Fork, a tenant farmer named Corbin Ash was clearing a spring house foundation for repair when he broke through into a similar passage, coursed stone, no mortar, a shelf holding a single object with no explanation attached to it, this time a woman's comb rather than a shoe. Azur's account, given once to a county extension agent and never repeated afterward, describes a row of grooves cut into the far wall at waist height, and states plainly that he did not count them, that he had already decided, standing in the cold of that passage with his lantern shaking, that counting them was the one thing he was not going to do. He sealed the spring house back up within the week, using stones salvaged from his own field fences, and the passage was never reopened. The spring house itself burned in 1951, cause unlisted on the county fire report, and Ash moved his family out of Pruett Fork entirely before the ash had cooled. And in 1937, 41 miles southwest near the White River Breaks, a rural mail carrier named Delford Pruett, investigating a family that had stopped collecting its post for 3 consecutive weeks, found their cabin empty, stock left standing in the yard, and a stone-lined chamber behind the chimney, bearing the same grooves Reeves would later photograph in Bellwood Hollow, cut in the same pattern, at the same spacing, by hands that never met each other across those distances and those years. Pruett's report to the postal inspector, filed because an abandoned mail route required one, makes no mention of a shelf or an object upon it, though a marginal note added later, in a different hand and different ink, asks only how far in did he go, with no answer recorded anywhere in the file. None of the 3 families who found these doors knew about the others. The phrasing each of them used to describe the cold inside, though, recorded independently by 3 different clerks in 3 different decades, is close enough in its particulars that a 4th party reading all 3 side by side would have a hard time believing it was coincidence, and harder still, explaining what it was instead. What the county record will not do, in any of the 3 cases, is finish the thought it starts. The Bellwood Hollow file exists today only as a line in a ledger of surveyor assignments, case number recorded, contents unspecified, the folder itself missing from the courthouse basement since at least the 1970s, according to the clerk who last tried to locate it. The tax auction ledger from 1931, the one recording the Corliss family's delinquency, is missing exactly the 2 pages that would have listed the buyer of record before the county itself took the parcel, cut close to the binding rather than torn, the stubs still visible if you know to look for them. Deputy Lloyd, the man who logged the discovery and never went past the shelf, put in for a transfer to a desk assignment in the county recorder's office the following spring, and stayed there, by all accounts a competent and unremarkable clerk, until his retirement 2 decades later. Nothing in his personnel file explains the move, and nobody who worked beside him afterward remembers him ever mentioning Bellwood Hollow again. And Reeves, the geologist who photographed the grooves but not the shelf, left behind a report that ends mid-sentence on the recommendation for further assessment and simply does not continue, as though the next page had been written and then removed, rather than never written at all. The survey office's own index lists that report at 4 pages. Only 3 have ever been found. Wendell did not find the letter on the first night, or even the second. He spent those first 2 visits doing what any careful man would do, measuring the chamber, sketching the grooves, turning the tin box over in his hands, without yet finding the nerve to force it open. And it was only on the 3rd visit, running his palm along the inside face of the door itself before he sealed it, that his fingers caught the edge of something driven into the wood, with a single iron nail near the top hinge, folded small enough to have gone unnoticed twice already. What Wendell Tolliver pulled free that afternoon was a single sheet of paper, brittle at the folds, signed at the bottom, in a hand the county later matched to Corliss family correspondence, held by a cousin 2 counties over, the only surviving sample of that handwriting anywhere outside this passage. He read it once by lantern light, standing in that chamber, with the cold coming up through his boots, and he did not read it again until he was back in his own kitchen with Opal beside him and the door bolted behind them both. It read, as close to verbatim as the ledger copy allows, "To whoever opens this door next, know that we did not leave the mules in harness or the wash in the tub because we were careless. We left them because on the night before we went, we heard the counting start again behind this wall. 30 and 1 same as always. And my father told me a man does not wait past the counting to see what comes through. He only leaves and takes what he can carry and does not look back at the house long enough to notice what is standing in the door of it. And I am writing this down now so that whoever finds this passage again will know it was not neglect that took this family off this land. It was that we listened and we went. And if you have found your way this far in, I would ask you to do the same before you count past 30. Wendell showed the letter to no one outside his own household for 3 weeks. Not the sheriff, not Reeves, not even the county surveyor who eventually logged its existence second-hand, from Wendell's own description rather than the page itself. Because by the time anyone official asked to see it, Wendell would only say that the letter had been lost in the ceiling of the passage, which the concrete work made impossible to disprove. Whether that was true, or whether he simply could not stand to hand it over to a filing cabinet in Ozarks, where it might sit forgotten the way the Corliss family itself had sat forgotten for 13 years, is not a question the record answers. What the record does show is that Wendell Tolliver, a man who had never in 8 years missed a payment or an appointment or a Sunday service, did not need to be asked twice about what to do with that door. He and Garrett filled the passage with rubble hauled up from the creek bed and poured a concrete cap over the cellar door within the month, working through 2 full days without stopping to eat a proper meal. And Opal would tell a neighbor years later that she stood at the top of the cellar ladder the whole time and would not go back down it, not even after the concrete had cured. The family left Bellwood Hollow entirely in the spring of 1956, 2 years before the Sable Fork Reservoir the state had been surveying for finally closed its floodgates and put the whole hollow under 60 feet of water, farmhouse, cellar, sealed passage and all. Wendell sold the parcel to the state at the standard reservoir rate, no higher, and never once tried to negotiate for more, which his son later said was the only time in his life anyone had ever seen Wendell Tolliver leave money on a table without an argument. The lake that covers it now draws boats every summer, fishermen anchoring over what used to be a hollow full of hickory and shortleaf pine without any notion of the farmhouse sitting below their hulls, and nothing about the surface suggests what sits beneath it, which is, in its way, the most honest thing about the entire county record. Somewhere under that water the door is still shut, sealed behind a cap of concrete that has now spent 7 decades at the bottom of a reservoir nobody built to hide anything. Nobody has opened it since Wendell Tolliver poured that concrete, and by his own account, given once to a county surveyor and never repeated for anyone else on the record, he never went looking afterward to find out whether 31 was really where the counting stopped, or only where his own nerve had stopped listening, and whether the latch on that second door had been facing him that first evening because something on the other side had already known he would eventually come. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.